In the early years of the Second Age, before their names were forgotten, they were not shadows. They were men. If you enjoy calm stories from Middle-earth, you can stay a while, and if you'd like more like this, you can follow the channel. Now, the story begins. Kings, rulers, and lords of lands that stretched far beyond what would later remain in memory. Their realms were not small, nor were they hidden. They stood in the open world beneath the same sky as all others, shaped by the same passage of time. Their cities rose from stone and earth, built not only for defense, but for endurance. Roads connected their lands, and their people moved freely between them. There was order in what they governed, and structure in how they ruled. They were not alike in all things. Some were wise, holding their power with care, listening more than they spoke. Others ruled with certainty that did not allow question, their authority firm and rarely challenged. But all of them were known, their names carried, their presence remained, and within each of them there was something that had not yet changed. Time, for men, does not stand still. Even in those years, when the world seemed larger and less confined, the passing of time remained certain. No king could hold his rule forever. No strength remained untouched by years. And this was known to them, not as fear, but as truth. Some accepted it, others did not. It was not spoken of openly in halls or among their people, but it remained within thought. The knowledge that what had been built would one day pass to another, that what had been held would one day be released. For some, this was enough. For others, it was not. Far to the east, and in lands that did not lie close to the memory of the West, there were whispers of something more. Not promises, not commands, only the suggestion that what was given to men need not end so quickly. That time, though it moved, might be held, extended, not stopped, but delayed. These whispers did not reach all at once. They did not arrive with force. They appeared where they were received, where they were considered, and where they were not turned away. The kings who would later be remembered as the Nine did not seek this out together. They were not gathered. They did not stand in one place and make a choice. Each came to it in his own time, in his own way, through paths that did not cross. At first, there was no change, nothing visible, nothing that marked a difference between what they had been and what they were becoming. They ruled as they always had. They spoke as they always had. They remained within the world, unchanged in form. But something had begun, not in action, not in appearance, but in thought. A quiet turning towards something beyond what had been accepted before. The idea that time might not hold them as it held others, that their rule might not pass as all rule must. And this idea did not fade. It remained, held quietly, considered without urgency, but not forgotten. They did not arrive as something to be feared, not at first. The rings were not brought with warning, nor with signs that marked them as dangerous. They were given as gifts, carefully, deliberately, and not without understanding of who would receive them. Each was offered not to a crowd, but to a single hand. A king, a ruler, a man whose name already carried weight. There was no urgency in their giving, no pressure, only the quiet presentation of something that seemed fitting. The rings were not identical in all ways, though they shared a form. Each was made with purpose, shaped with intention, and given where it would be accepted. Those who received them did not refuse, not because they were deceived in a simple way, but because the gift aligned with something already present within them. Desire to hold what they had, to extend it, to remain. The rings did not change them at once. There was no moment where their nature shifted, no visible transformation. They were worn as any ring might be worn, carried, kept close, at times forgotten, as objects often are when they become familiar. But they were not without effect. At first, it was subtle, a sense of clarity, not overwhelming, not unnatural, only a slight sharpening of thought, a steadiness in decision, the ability to see more clearly what lay before them. This was not questioned. It was accepted as something that belonged to them, as something they had always possessed, now more fully realized. Time, too, seemed to move differently. Not stopped, not slowed, but less present. The passing of days did not weigh as it had before. The awareness of it softened. A year did not feel as long. A decade did not press as heavily. And this, too, was accepted, not as something unusual, but as something deserved. The kings continued to rule. Their lands remained. Their people did not see a change that could be named. Their rulers were still present, still certain, still strong. But there was something beneath that had begun to shift. The rings were worn more often, not always consciously, not always with intent, but they were not set aside. They became part of what was carried, part of what was held, part of what was relied upon, and slowly, without force, without command, the connection between them and the rings deepened, not as a bond that could be seen, but as something that did not need to be broken. The thought of removing them did not arise, or if it did not remain, because there was no reason to. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been lost, only something had been added, something that seemed to belong. And so they continued, unchanged in appearance, unquestioned in their rule, and yet no longer entirely as they had been. The change did not come as a single turning. There was no moment when they could have said that what they were had ended and something else had begun. It moved more quietly than that, or gradually, like the passing of time itself, unnoticed until enough had gathered to be felt. The kings continued to rule as they always had. Their halls remained filled. Their people still came before them. Voices were heard. Decisions were made. Nothing in the structure of their realms had yet begun to fail. And yet, within that structure, something had begun to shift. Their thoughts, once grounded in the present, began to reach further, not toward the future as it would come, but toward what might be held beyond it. The passing of time, which had once been accepted, no longer settled in the same way. It was no longer simply the path all men followed. It became something to consider, something to measure, something to resist. This did not trouble them. Not at first. It seemed natural. A king should endure. A ruler should remain. What had been built should not pass easily to another. These were not new ideas, but now they held more weight, more presence. And the rings, though small and often unnoticed, remained, worn more often than not, felt without being touched, present without being seen. Their influence did not press, it did not force, it aligned, it strengthened what was already there, and in doing so, it deepened it. The kings began to withdraw, though not in a way that could be clearly seen. They did not leave their halls, they did not abandon their people, but something in their presence became more distant, less immediate, as though part of them was no longer entirely within the moment they stood in. They listened still, they spoke still, but the space between these things grew, not in time, but in feeling. Their voices did not rise as often, their words became fewer, more measured, more final, and those who came before them began to notice, not as a change that could be named, only as something that had shifted, a difference in presence, a sense that their king was not entirely where he had once been. The land itself did not respond. The plains, the forests, the cities, none of these changed, but the connection between ruler and realm grew quieter, less certain, not broken, but not as it had been. The rings remained, always. There was no moment where they were set aside, no decision to remove them, because there was no reason to. Nothing had been lost, only something had been gained. And yet, over time, something else began to fade. Not strength, not authority, but immediacy. The world did not press against them as it had before. It felt more distant, more quiet, as though a thin space had formed between them and all that surrounded them. They did not fear this. They did not question it. They accepted it, as they had accepted everything else, because it came without force, without pain, without warning, only as a continuation of what had already begun. And so, the change deepened, not in appearance, not in action, but in being. There was no moment when they understood what had been lost, no clear dividing line between what they had been and what they were becoming. The change did not ask to be noticed. It continued, quietly. The kings still sat in their halls. They still wore the form of men. They still spoke and were heard. And yet, something within them no longer answered the world in the same way. The distance that had once been slight began to deepen. Not outwardly, not in a way that could be seen by all, but within. The world no longer felt as near as it had. Sound did not carry the same weight. Light did not fall in the same way. The presence of others did not settle as fully. It was not that these things had changed. It was that their place within them had. The rings remained, always. There was no thought of setting them aside, no awareness that they had become necessary, only that they were, that they belonged. Time no longer moved around them as it once had. It passed, but it did not gather. Days did not feel as full. Years did not feel as long. What once would have marked the passing of life now slipped by without weight. And still, they endured. Their bodies did not fail. Their strength did not leave them. They remained where others would have passed on. And this too was accepted, not questioned, not feared, only understood as something that had been given. What had been given did not remain unchanged. The connection to the world continued to loosen, not in action, but in presence. They stood where they had always stood, yet something in them no longer stood fully within that place. Their voices, when they spoke, carried less warmth. Not colder, not harsh, only distant, as though they spoke from somewhere slightly removed. Their gaze no longer rested where it once had. It passed over things, not ignoring them, but not holding them either. And those who came before them began to feel it more clearly. A sense that their king was not entirely there, not absent, but not fully present. Some withdrew, not in fear, but in uncertainty. Others remained, holding to what had always been, but even they could not deny what had begun to change. The kings themselves did not resist it. They did not see it as loss, because nothing had been taken from them in a way they could name. They still held power, still held authority, still remained, and yet something had already begun to pass beyond their reach. The world itself no longer held them as it once had. Its weight did not rest upon them. Its presence did not fully reach them. And in that space, they began to fade. Not vanish, not disappear, but become less bound, less held, less part of what they had once ruled. The process did not end. It did not slow. It continued, as all things do when they are not turned away. And with each passing year, though they did not feel it as others would, they moved further from what they had been and closer to what they would become. There came a time when they were no longer seen as they had been, not because they had chosen to withdraw, not because they had left their halls or abandoned their lands, but because the world itself no longer held them in the same way. At first, it was uncertain, a presence felt, but not clearly found. A voice heard, but not easily placed. Those who stood before them would look, and for a moment, not understand what they were seeing. Not absence, not emptiness, only a lack of clarity, as though something stood there but did not fully take shape. The kings did not notice this change as others did. To them, nothing had been lost. They remained, they spoke, they ruled, but the world no longer returned their presence in full. Light did not settle upon them as it had before. It passed, as though it did not find what it once did. Their forms, though still there, no longer held the same certainty. Edges softened, details faded, not in a way that could be easily described, only in a way that could be felt. Those who came before them began to hesitate, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. Where once they had stood before a king, now they stood before something less clearly defined, not lesser, not diminished, but altered. Some spoke of it quietly, not in open halls, not in ways meant to spread, only in private words, shared without confidence, that something had changed, that their rulers were not as they had been. But even these words did not remain long, because there was no clear way to describe what had been seen, and so the silence returned. The kings themselves did not question what was happening. They did not reach for what had been. They did not seek to understand what had changed. Because to them nothing had. Their thoughts remained their own. Their will remained strong. Their purpose remained clear. Only their place within the world had shifted. They were no longer bound to it in the same way. They did not stand within it fully. They existed alongside it, between what was seen and what was not. And as this continued, the need to be seen began to fade as well. Not by decision, but by nature. What had once been important, presence, recognition, the visible sign of rule, no longer held the same meaning. They did not withdraw, but they were no longer fully present. And so the world moved around them without holding them as it once had. Their names were still known, their rules still recognized, but their forms no longer anchored them to those things. They had not disappeared, but they were no longer part of what could be clearly seen. They did not gather in one place, not at first. There was no moment where all who had changed came together and understood what they had become. Each remained where he had been, in lands once ruled openly, in halls that no longer held them as they once had. But the distance between them and the world had already grown too great for such places to remain their center. The need for them began to shift. Not toward wool, but toward something else. Something that did not belong to the lands they had once governed. Their movement changed. They did not remain still as often. They traveled, not with purpose that could be seen, not toward places that could be named, only in response to something that drew them. A presence not of the land, not of the world they had known, but of something beyond it. The One Ring had been made, though they did not see it, though they did not know it in the way others might have known. They felt it, not as a call, not as a command, but as a direction, a pull that did not require understanding, only response. And so they moved across lands that no longer held them, through places where their presence was no longer clearly seen. Their forms, now faded beyond recognition, did not mark their passing. Only a sense remained, a feeling that something had moved where nothing could be seen. The horses they rode were not as other horses. They did not resist. They did not question. They carried what sat upon them without knowing what it was. And in time, even these forms became less certain, less defined, more part of the shadow that had claimed their riders. They were no longer kings, not in the way that had once been known. They did not sit in halls. They did not hear the voices of their people. They did not rule. And yet, they remained bound, more strongly than before, not to land, not to time, but to will. A will that was not their own, not taken from them, but accepted, given place. Allowed, the presence that drew them became clear, not in form, but in certainty. They did not question it. They did not resist it, because there was nothing within them that remained apart from it. What they had once been had not been removed. It had been changed, shifted, drawn into something that did not allow separation. And so they became what would later be known, not in name, not yet, but in nature. Riders, moving through shadow, not seen, not fully present, but always there. In the years that followed, they were no longer remembered as they had once been. Their names did not remain. Their lands passed to others. Their halls, once filled with voices, no longer held their presence. What had been known faded. Not all at once, not completely, but enough that what remained could no longer be traced clearly to what had come before. They did not return. They did not stand again among men. They did not reclaim what had once been theirs. Because what they had become no longer belonged to that world, they remained, but not as kings, not as rulers, not as men. They moved where they were drawn, not by choice, not by desire, but by a will that held them fully. A will that had not forced them, but had been accepted, piece by piece, until nothing remained outside it. Their presence was no longer part of the world that could be seen. It existed alongside it, within it, but not held by it. Those who encountered them did not always understand what they faced. They did not see clearly. They did not hear clearly. Only a sense remained, a feeling that something had passed near them, something that did not belong to what they knew. They did not cry out. They did not strike without reason. They did not move with chaos. They endured, as they had always endured. Now that endurance no longer belonged to life. It belonged to something else, something that did not pass, something that did not rest. The rings remained, bound to them, not worn as before, but held, part of what they had become, and through those rings they remained bound still, not to themselves, but to what had shaped them. They had not been destroyed, they had not been ended, they had been continued, in a form that did not return, in a presence that did not release. The world moved on, as it always does. New kings rose, new lands were shaped, new names were spoken. And what had once been known faded into what could only be remembered in fragments. The 9 were no longer counted among the living, but neither were they gone. They remained in the quiet spaces of the world, in the distance between one place and another, in the moments where something is felt but not seen, not as a memory, but as a presence. And in that presence, there is no beginning, no return, only what remains. If you'd like to remain in these quiet stories, there are more waiting for you. You can stay and let another begin. And if you return often, you can follow the channel. Good night.